My son stole $210,000 from his sister's college fund. Then he shoved me into the kitchen counter when I begged him to give it back. I stood there, bruised, not just on my face, but in a place no mother ever wants to feel broken. And that was the moment I stopped being silent, because what he didn't know was I still had one move left. I was folding towels in the laundry room when I heard the front door creak open. It was Brandon. He didn't call ahead, didn't text, just walked in like this was still his house. Mary Beth was upstairs studying, and the house smelled faintly of lemon cleaner. I remember that because it was the last peaceful moment before everything began to shift. Brandon had that smile he used when he wanted something, the kind that looked polite if you didn't know him well, but too practiced if you did. He leaned on the kitchen counter, fiddling with a mug I hadn't offered him. Said he just dropped by. Said he'd been thinking about getting some things in order for the future. Asked if he could take a look at my old documents. Wills, retirement stuff, whatever was left of the paperwork after my husband died. I didn't think twice. He was my son, my only boy. He had his flaws, sure, but I raised him, held him through fevers, scraped his knees, watched him sob when his first dog passed. So I nodded. I gave him the drawer key and went back to folding. That was early May. Life with Mary Beth was quiet, in the kind of way you don't notice until it's gone. She made tea in the evenings, always steeped too long, and we'd sit by the window while she talked about her college plans. We had worked hard to build that stillness. After her father passed, there was a silence in the house we had to learn how to live with. And we did. Until the envelope came. It was from the scholarship liaison. A notice, short, cold, direct. Her college savings account had fallen below the minimum threshold for disbursement. Less than $3,000 remained. The fund we built for 15 years. The one her father started before he was even sick. My hands trembled. I reread it 4 times. Then I checked the balance myself. $2,456, where there should have been $210,000. At first I thought it was a mistake. I called the bank. They confirmed the withdrawals. 6 separate transactions over 2 months. I asked for copies. They mailed me statements. I sat at the kitchen table, heart thudding, tracing every transaction. Large transfers. One went toward a property in Clearwater, another to a dealership in Tampa. The names meant nothing to me, but the signature on the request forms, it was mine. At least, it looked like it. I felt sick. Betrayal isn't a clean break. It seeps in, slow and sour, until everything familiar starts to rot. I didn't tell Mary Beth right away. I couldn't. She had a midterm coming up. She still talked about Princeton like it was real. I couldn't take that away from her. Not yet. I sat in the dark that night. The house didn't feel like home. I kept thinking about Brandon at the counter. The fake smile. The charm in his voice. The way he said, "Let me help you organize things, Mum." And I let him. If you've ever trusted someone so deeply that you stopped protecting yourself, then you might understand what I was feeling. It wasn't just the money. It was the lie wrapped in a hug. The theft delivered with a kiss on the cheek. And I know some of you listening might be thinking, that couldn't happen to me. But the thing is, it doesn't happen overnight. It happens in inches. It happens when love and trust get used as tools. Back then, I still believed I could talk to him. Still believed he'd come clean. But I didn't know yet that my son had already decided who mattered and who didn't. And I certainly didn't know what he'd do when I asked him to give it back. That part, I'll never forget. I waited until the house was quiet. Mary Beth had gone to bed early, her textbooks stacked neatly on the coffee table, her mug of cold tea forgotten beside them. I sat alone at the kitchen table with the folder from the bank, the pages spread out like pieces of something broken I could never quite put back together. I found the forms, each one authorizing a withdrawal, each one signed with my name. I hadn't signed them. I knew I hadn't. But they looked exactly like my handwriting. Same tilt, same slight hesitation at the end of my last name. My hands shook. The room felt too still. I pulled out the small metal box I kept in the back of the pantry. Inside were copies of every legal document I had touched in the last 20 years. Taxes, old wills, Brandon's student loan paperwork from when he was 22. I found my original signature on a form from the Social Security office. I laid it side by side with the ones from the bank. At first glance, they matched. But the longer I looked, the more the differences came into focus. The ink pressure, the spacing. It was like someone who had studied me too well had tried just a bit too hard. Brandon. The realization settled in slow, not like a flash of lightning, but like the tide crawling up your legs before you notice you're drowning. I remembered the week he asked for my financial paperwork. He had come over 3 times that week. Once he had even offered to take the recycling out, said he was just helping out while he could. I had smiled, grateful, thinking this was him trying to be close again. Now I saw it differently. Every kind word, every helpful gesture, every quiet moment in my home. It had been a setup. I needed more proof, something that didn't depend on signatures. I called the bank again the next morning, pretending I was confused about the process, and asked if they could confirm which device or IP address had initiated the online transfers. The woman on the line was polite but firm, said that kind of information required a formal investigation. I thanked her anyway. That afternoon, I called Lane. Lane and I used to work together at the library before I retired. She had gone back to school for accounting and now worked for a private financial investigator. I hadn't spoken to her in over a year, but the moment she heard my voice, she asked what was wrong. I told her everything. Not just the missing money, but the signatures, the withdrawals, the property in Clearwater. She didn't interrupt once. When I finished, there was a pause. She said she'd come by the next morning. Lane showed up in jeans and a blazer, holding a worn leather bag and a laptop. She didn't waste time. She opened the statements, scrolled through my emails, asked me questions about when Brandon had been in the house. She took notes. Quiet. Efficient. She wasn't there to comfort me. She was there to help me see clearly. By late afternoon, she leaned back in her chair and looked at me differently. He used your name and authorization to transfer the money into a holding company, she said, and then used that company to purchase real estate. You're listed nowhere on the deed, not even as a co-signer. He erased you entirely from the transaction trail. I sat still, hands in my lap. My knees ached from sitting so long. My mouth was dry. Lane wasn't done. She showed me a copy of the LLC registration tied to the purchase. It had been formed 3 months ago. The listed address was a P.O. box in Tampa. The signature on the registration was Brandon's. That name again, clean and confident. She showed me a social media post from a woman named Brenna, a picture of her standing on the front steps of a pastel blue house in Clearwater, champagne in hand. The caption read, "New Beginnings." I recognized her. She had come to Thanksgiving last year. Brandon had introduced her as a colleague. Lane closed the laptop and looked at me. There was no more guessing, no more hoping, no more room for maybes. Brandon had taken everything his father and I had worked for, everything Mary Beth had earned with her late nights, her part-time job at the diner, her straight A's. He had stolen not just money, but future, trust, the belief that family protects its own. And he had done it, with my name. I sat there long after Lane left, listening to the house settle. Every sound felt louder than usual. The creak of the pipes, the hum of the refrigerator, the way the wind moved the tree outside Mary Beth's window. And in that silence, I made a choice. I wouldn't confront him just yet. I needed to understand exactly what kind of son I had raised before I decided what kind of mother I needed to become. It was a Thursday afternoon when I asked Brandon to come over. I didn't tell him why, just said I had some questions about a few financial documents I needed help sorting out. His tone on the phone was flat but agreeable, said he could swing by after work. Mary Beth had gone to visit a friend for the weekend. I didn't want her in the house when I confronted him. I didn't know what would happen, but I had a sense it would not be gentle. When Brandon arrived, he didn't take off his coat. He stood in the doorway of the kitchen like a man ready to leave as soon as he arrived. His phone buzzed twice in his pocket. He didn't silence it. I slid the folder across the table. He glanced at it, then back at me. Said nothing. I told him what I found, that the college fund was gone, that the transfers had been made using my name, that I had the documents, the dates, the amounts, the matching signatures. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I stated facts. He didn't sit down. He didn't look at the papers. He crossed his arms and smiled in that tight, mocking way I had only seen a few times before. It was the same smile he used when he was 10 and got caught breaking a window and said it wasn't him even with the bat in his hand. Then he said it. He told me that it wasn't really my money to begin with, that Dad had left things too open, that if someone didn't take charge, it would have all gone to waste. He said Mary Beth didn't need that kind of money, said the world didn't work that way anymore. Kids should figure things out on their own. He leaned closer, voice lower, said he earned it. I stood there, my hands gripping the back of the chair, knuckles pale. I asked him to return what he took, to do the right thing, to remember that this was his sister's future, not a stock option, not a bargaining chip. He laughed, short, dismissive, cold. Then he said I was lucky he didn't take more. I stepped around the table, my voice cracked when I said his name. I told him I didn't recognize who he had become, that he wasn't raised to believe in taking, that I didn't understand how he could do this to his own family. He didn't like that. His eyes changed, his jaw tightened. He stepped forward suddenly and shoved me backward. My hip hit the edge of the counter hard, and I lost my footing. I caught myself against the dishwasher, but the shock of it was worse than the pain. I looked at him, waiting for him to realize what he had done, but he didn't flinch, didn't apologize. He told me to stay out of things I didn't understand, that I was too old to manage finances, that this was how things worked now, and if I didn't like it, I could go live in a nursing home and let him deal with the rest. Then he walked out. The door slammed behind him. The whole house seemed to hold its breath. I stood there for a long time, afraid to move. My legs felt weak. My side throbbed. But mostly it was the weight of it all. The betrayal. The violence. The knowledge that this man, my son, had chosen power over family, greed over love, and he didn't even blink. I sat down slowly, lowering myself onto the floor. The tile was cold, and my breathing was uneven. I tried to collect my thoughts, to make sense of what had just happened. But all I could think of was the way he looked at me, like I was in his way. Eventually, I got up. I locked the door behind me. I checked the windows. I turned off the lights. Then I went upstairs and took a long shower, letting the hot water run until my fingers shriveled. I didn't cry. I felt something worse than tears, something quieter, a stillness that came from knowing the truth and knowing there was no going back. The next morning, I took pictures of the bruises on my hip. I saved them on a flash drive and labeled the folder with the date. I printed out the bank records again and clipped them together. I placed them in a new file with Lane's contact card taped to the front. Then I sat at the kitchen table and made a list, not of what I had lost, but of what I had left, what I could still do, what was still mine. Brandon thought he had won, that his violence had silenced me, that his cruelty had pushed me into retreat. But he had made a mistake. He had shown me exactly who he was. And now I no longer felt conflicted. I felt clear. I knew what had to come next. The morning after Brandon shoved me, I didn't wake up with rage. I woke up with something far colder, a steadiness I hadn't felt in years. The kind that doesn't burn through you like fire, but settles into your bones like winter. I didn't cry. I didn't shake. I made coffee, turned on the porch light, and waited for the sun to rise. Then I called Lane. By the time she arrived, I had already sorted the documents by type and date. Photocopies of the withdrawal slips, screenshots of the fake signature forms, photos of the bruises, the timeline, the bank contacts, and a list of everything I remembered Brandon saying when he pushed me. Word for word. Lane didn't say much, just looked through the pages and nodded. Her eyes stopped when she got to the photo of Brenner on the porch of the Clearwater house. She tapped the edge of the printout once, like it confirmed something she had suspected. She pulled her laptop from her bag and got to work. For the next few hours, my kitchen turned into something else. Not a place for tea and toast, but a quiet command center. Lane's fingers moved fast. She requested records from the Florida property database, checked the business registry for Brandon's LLC, looked up recent car purchases tied to his name. Everything was documented, traced, archived. I sat across from her, watching her work. She didn't offer comfort, she offered clarity. And that was what I needed. By early afternoon, she looked up and said something that changed the shape of the air around us. He didn't just use your name. He impersonated your authority as financial custodian of the college fund, which, according to the legal documents you signed when Robert died, makes this not just fraud, but a violation of a fiduciary trust. Those words sat in my mind like bricks. Fiduciary trust. I hadn't even remembered that detail. When Robert passed, we had designated that account with my name as custodian for Mary Beth until she turned 18. There were legal safeguards, and Brandon had bypassed every one of them. Lane asked if I still had the original paperwork from the trust. I did. It was in the fireproof box in my closet upstairs. I brought it down, and she took photographs of each page. Then she asked if I had a lawyer. I didn't. Not since Robert. But I remembered someone. Timothy Ashby. He had handled our estate planning years ago and now served part-time on the community council. Lane raised an eyebrow when I mentioned his name. She knew him, said he was still practicing and had a reputation for being quiet, strategic, and deeply loyal to old clients. She told me to wait before contacting him. First, she wanted to send everything in a clean brief, organized, legally sound. That way I wouldn't be showing up with a folder full of emotion, but a case built on paper and proof. I agreed. Lane spent the next 2 days assembling the package. She even included a cover memo detailing the timeline, violations, and potential legal ramifications. Everything was dated, labeled, and cross-referenced. I watched her build a case, not just against a criminal, but against the son I raised. There was something shattering about that. But I didn't stop her, because I knew this wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about my name, about the years I had spent putting everyone else first, about Mary Beth, about the silence I had swallowed when Robert got sick, about the way I had let things go, because it felt easier than confrontation. That time was over. On the third morning, Lane handed me a flash drive and a printed binder. Said she would email the digital copy to Mr. Ashby, but it would be good for me to bring it in person too. Said it helped lawyers see that I was serious, that I had the will to follow through. I made an appointment for the following Tuesday. Then I walked into Mary Beth's room. She was sitting cross-legged on her bed, textbooks open, her earbuds in. I sat on the edge of the bed and waited for her to notice me. When she pulled out her earbuds, I told her everything. Not all at once, not the legal words, not the full damage, but the truth. That the money was gone, that Brandon had taken it, that I was working to fix it, but it would take time. She didn't speak right away, just stared at me. Then she asked if he had hurt me. I told her yes. She took a breath, sat up straighter. I saw something settle behind her eyes. Not panic, not fear, something sharper. She nodded once and said she wasn't surprised. Said she had seen the way he looked at her last Thanksgiving, like she was an inconvenience. She said she had never trusted him fully. And then, in the softest voice, she said thank you. Not because I fixed it, not because I had answers, but because I told her the truth. That night, I couldn't sleep, not because of fear, but because I knew what had begun. This wasn't just a betrayal. It was a reckoning, and I was finally ready to face it. Mr. Ashby's office hadn't changed much since Robert and I last sat there, signing the final pages of our wills. The same old photographs lined the wall, black and white portraits of early city councils, rows of proud faces and stiff suits. The air still smelled faintly of tobacco and lemon oil. He greeted me with a calm nod, then gestured for me to sit, never once asking how I was. That, somehow, was a relief. I handed him the binder Lane had prepared. He adjusted his glasses and read for a full 15 minutes in silence. I sat still, hands folded in my lap. When he finished, he closed it with a quiet thump and looked at me for the first time. He said the situation was serious. He said what Brandon had done fell under several legal violations, and if I chose to press forward, there would be real consequences. Not just financial restitution, civil penalties, potential criminal exposure. He said the impersonation of a fiduciary custodian, especially of a fund intended for a minor, could be pursued more aggressively than standard fraud. I told him I wasn't here to destroy my son. I was here to protect my daughter. And my name. He nodded. He understood. Then he said something that stayed with me. Sometimes the hardest part of justice is how long it takes to look like mercy. I left his office with a calm that didn't feel like peace, but something sturdier. Resolve. He told me he would file a preliminary notice of claim against the LLC that now held the Clearwater property. He would send a cease and desist to the title company, and he would prepare the necessary filings to begin recovering the trust assets, starting with a court-ordered injunction. That evening, Lane returned with another folder, this time containing public records she had pulled on Brenna, Brandon's mistress. Her real name was Brenna Talcott. She had one prior bankruptcy, 2 failed businesses, and had been listed as co-owner of a short-lived event company that folded mid-pandemic. Her online presence was curated, polished, designed for image. But the real Brenna was someone who knew how to spot an opening and take it. It stung to admit, even in silence, that my son had been so easily manipulated, but I could no longer separate his choices from his character. He had made 1,000 decisions between the first lie and the last push. She might have joined the game late, but he built the board. By the end of the week, Timothy had delivered the first formal filing to the county court. I received a stamped copy with a temporary injunction freezing any future transactions involving the house in Clearwater. Brandon could not sell, lease, or transfer it. That was the first real breath I had taken in days. But nothing stayed still for long. The following Sunday, as I came home from the grocery store, I found Brandon sitting on my porch, hands in his jacket pockets, head down. He didn't look up until I was halfway to the door. I kept my keys in hand. I didn't invite him in. He stood slowly and said he just wanted to talk. I said he had 5 minutes. He told me I had embarrassed him, that the filing had made it impossible for him to move forward with a business loan, that Brenna was furious, that people in his circle were asking questions. I didn't respond. He shifted, tried a softer tone, said he was under pressure, that he made a mistake, that I should have come to him privately instead of trying to ruin his life. Still, I said nothing. Then he raised his voice, said I was overreacting, said it wasn't like I needed the money, said Marybeth would land on her feet, that this was about pride, not justice. I looked him in the eye and told him he was wrong, told him this was about truth, that no child, no matter how loved, had the right to rewrite someone else's story. He didn't like that. He turned sharp again, told me I was choosing Marybeth over him, that I'd always done that maybe this was why he had to take things into his own hands. I didn't flinch. I told him he had already made his choices, and that I was now making mine. Then I opened the door and walked inside. I locked it behind me. That night, I sat down with Marybeth and showed her the court documents. She read them quietly, her brow furrowed. She asked a few questions, nothing she couldn't process. Then she placed the papers down and said she wanted to help. I told her she already was, by living with grace in the middle of something that wasn't her fault. In the days that followed, Brandon did not return, but emails from his attorney arrived. Angry, defensive, full of spin. Mr. Ashby handled each one with precision. He wasn't trying to crush Brandon, he was simply making sure the line stayed clear. There is no excuse for theft, not from a stranger, not from a neighbor, and certainly not from a son. The silence between Brandon and me stretched longer with each day, not empty, but full of things unspoken. I wasn't waiting for an apology. I was building a life where I no longer needed one. A life grounded not in what had been taken, but in what I refused to give up. My dignity, my daughter's future, the truth, my voice. And somewhere inside that silence, I began to feel something I hadn't touched in weeks. Control. Under a pale morning sky, I stood at the kitchen window watching frost settle over the hedges. The house was silent, but not heavy. It was the kind of quiet that feels earned. After everything that had unraveled, I had expected to feel hollow. Instead, I felt clear. Timothy called that afternoon. He said the court had granted an emergency hearing to review our injunction. Brandon had filed a counter-motion claiming hardship and attempted to argue that the funds were a gift. Timothy didn't sound rattled. He said we had the documentation to show otherwise. The hearing was set for the following Wednesday. I didn't tell Marybeth right away. She'd been sleeping better, eating again, laughing with her classmates over long video calls. I didn't want to pull her back into the tension unless I had to. That night, I reviewed everything Lane and Timothy had prepared. The digital trail, the withdrawal history, the falsified signature patterns. It was like reading a diary I hadn't written. The decisions Brandon made, one by one, stitched together a version of me that had never existed. A woman who would betray her own daughter. A woman who would fund a stranger's lifestyle and call it love. I wasn't going to let that fiction stand. When I walked into the courthouse, I wore the same navy coat I had worn to Robert's memorial. I hadn't put it on since that day. It still smelled faintly of cedar. Lane came with me. She carried 2 folders and didn't say much, just walked beside me, her steps steady and sure. Brandon arrived 5 minutes before the session began. He wore a grey suit too tight at the shoulders, like he had borrowed it. His lawyer followed, a younger man with slicked hair and a voice built for negotiation. Brandon didn't look at me. I didn't look away. The judge was a woman in her 60s, with sharp eyes and no patience for theatrics. She reviewed the injunction, asked questions about the trust account, and made it clear that the purpose of the hearing was not to resolve the entire case, but to determine whether Brandon's control over the Clearwater property should remain frozen. Timothy spoke with precision. He presented the trust documentation, highlighted the custodial role I had legally held. He explained the timeline, how Brandon accessed the funds, transferred them, and concealed the purchase under a separate entity without consent or legal standing. Brandon's lawyer claimed family misunderstanding. He implied that I had grown forgetful, that Brandon believed the funds were freely given, that no malicious intent had occurred. Then the judge asked for the signatures. We provided both sets, mine and the ones used in the withdrawal documents. She compared them, slowly, silently. After a long pause, she looked at Brandon and said she would not be lifting the injunction. She said the pattern of behavior warranted further investigation and noted that Brandon's justification lacked substance. Then she set a date for the formal trial. As we left the courtroom, Brandon finally looked at me. His expression was tight. No remorse, no regret, just calculation. It hit me then. He hadn't come to clear his name. He had come to win. And now that he hadn't, something in him had shifted. The next morning, my mailbox held a single unmarked envelope. Inside was a photograph. Mary Beth, leaving school, taken from a distance. No note, no threat, just a message wrapped in silence. I sat at the dining table for almost an hour, staring at it. My hands didn't shake, my chest didn't tighten, but the air around me changed. Brandon wasn't trying to scare me. He was trying to control me again. But the difference now was, I had seen him clearly, and I would not unsee it. I took the photo to Timothy. He filed it with the court. He said we'd petition for a no-contact order. Lane agreed. She reached out to a private contact at the school and arranged for a temporary security monitor. Brandon had crossed a line he could not retreat from, and in doing so, he had finally answered the one thing I had been wondering since this all began. What would a son give up to keep what he stole? The answer was now clear. Everything. Even us, even her. But I wasn't going to give him anything more, especially not fear. The days following the court hearing moved like slow thunder, quiet on the outside, but something rumbled underneath. I could feel it in the way Mary Beth watched the front windows more often than before, in the way Lane kept her phone near at all times, in the way I double-checked the locks before bed. We didn't talk about the photo again. It lived now in the court file, under evidence, labelled and time-stamped. But it hovered in our house like smoke. Brandon had stopped calling. Instead, his lawyer sent a letter through Timothy. In it, Brandon offered to settle. He proposed to return half of the remaining amount from the college fund if I dropped the claim on the Clearwater property and agreed to dismiss the charges. He called it compromise, a peaceful resolution. Timothy's response was a single sentence. We decline. He didn't even ask me. He knew. That afternoon I took out the photo album I hadn't touched in years. I sat with it at the kitchen table. Page by page, I went through our family's history. Robert holding Brandon as a baby in the backyard. Brandon teaching Mary Beth to ride a bike. Christmas mornings, beach days, birthdays with candles half melted before we sang, and I didn't cry. I studied the photos like a woman reading an old map, trying to trace the road to where it all changed. When love became control, when protection became possession, when silence became permission, there was no clear point, just erosion, quiet, patient erosion. But now, I was no longer losing ground. I was rebuilding it. Mary Beth had begun preparing college applications again. She chose 3 schools, 2 in-state and 1 across the country. I helped her with her essays. We sat side by side in the evenings, her laptop open, my notes scribbled in pencil margins. She wanted to study psychology, said she wanted to understand how people became who they became. I said I thought that was brave. One morning, I found her sitting at the dining table with Lane, the 2 of them whispering, sharing coffee and granola bars. Lane was showing her how to create a basic financial plan, budgeting, interest rates, credit scores. Mary Beth nodded like someone who had already learned what happens when you leave your future in someone else's hands. I watched from the doorway. That was the kind of inheritance I wanted to give her now. Not money, not property, but self-trust. Later that week, Timothy sent word that Brandon had filed a motion to have the case dismissed, claiming undue emotional harm. He included fabricated emails, messages written in my name, laced with aggressive language, implying I had threatened him. Lane caught the forgery immediately. She traced the IP address used to send them. It belonged to a temporary server location, registered under a startup business, run by Brenner. Timothy filed a motion in response, attaching Lane's documentation. He requested a forensic analysis of all communications submitted by Brandon's attorney. The judge approved it within the hour. It wasn't just a defense anymore, it was a pattern, a strategy, a campaign to make me look unstable, emotional, vindictive, because that's what men like Brandon counted on, that the court would see an aging woman protecting her daughter as nothing more than a bitter mother than clinging to control. But I had built too strong a case for that. Still, the damage was slow, like water on stone. Each step forward took energy, and I began to feel it, in my joints, in my sleep, in the way my thoughts drifted sometimes when I was alone. One night, I stood in the garden, pruning dead leaves from the hydrangeas. It was cold. The sky was grey and low, and for a moment I let myself lean into the ache of it all. This was my son. This was my son, and I no longer recognized the way I used to love him. That was the hardest part. Not the money, not the court, but the grief of loving someone who no longer existed in the shape I remembered. Still, I didn't stop. The next morning I wrote out a letter, not for the court, not for Brandon, but for Mary Beth. I didn't tell her I was doing it. I just wrote. I told her the full truth, not just the facts, but the feelings, the doubt, the shame, the guilt that I hadn't seen it coming, the weight of silence, the reasons I had waited, the reasons I had stopped waiting. I folded it and placed it in her top drawer. She would find it when she needed it, because someday she might face her own version of this choice, to stay silent or to speak, to protect peace or to protect truth. And I wanted her to know she came from a line of women who chose truth, even when it cost more. That afternoon, Lane called with an update. The forensic report was complete. The emails were confirmed fakes. The judge sanctioned Brandon's legal team for submitting false evidence, a fine, a warning, and an official note entered into the case record that the plaintiff had attempted to mislead the court. It didn't end the case, but it changed the story. We weren't just a mother and daughter trying to reclaim stolen money. We were witnesses to a deeper crime. A man trying to erase the people he had hurt by painting them as the problem. But the paint no longer stuck, and the truth was beginning to shine through. By the time we reached February, the frost had softened and the court date was locked in, March 15th. A quiet date. No birthdays, no anniversaries. Just a date that would come and go like any other day on the calendar, except for us. It would mark the end of pretending. Timothy called and asked if I wanted to give a personal statement. Not mandatory, he said, but it could carry weight. I told him I would. Not because I wanted to speak, but because I needed to be seen. I had spent too long invisible in my own story. Over the next few days, I rehearsed in the early mornings. I read out loud to the silence in my kitchen. I stood in the living room after Mary Beth had gone to bed and spoke my truth into the walls. I didn't memorize it. I let it come through me each time a little differently. I wanted it to feel real when I finally stood in that courtroom. Not a performance, a reckoning. Brandon, meanwhile, had gone quiet again. No new filings, no phone calls, no more letters. I knew the silence wasn't surrender. It was calculation. He was waiting, watching, likely planning something meant to derail everything at the last minute. He always preferred ambush to confrontation, but this time I had something stronger than strategy. I had endurance. Lane dropped by the house that Friday. She brought 2 sets of final binders, one for me, one for Timothy. Everything was cross-referenced, indexed, prepared for admission. Then she gave me a small manila envelope. Inside was a printed screenshot from one of Brenner's now deleted social media posts. It was dated 4 months prior, a photo of her holding a wine glass on the balcony of the Clearwater house. The caption said, "A new chapter begins, finally ours." Underneath it, Brandon had commented, "No more hiding, only forward." It was nothing criminal, but it was telling. It proved intent. While he was still actively transferring money and denying knowledge of the account details, he was building a life with that money, with that house, and calling it freedom. Lane said it wasn't a slam dunk, but it helped frame the emotional core of the case. It gave the judge context. I thanked her, then walked her to her car. She paused before getting in, looked at me, and said that no matter the outcome, I had already done what most never find the courage to do. I didn't answer, just nodded and held her gaze. There are some compliments you don't respond to. You just carry them. That weekend, Mary Beth came home from her part-time shift at the diner with a small envelope of her own. Inside were brochures from the colleges she had applied to, each one marked with little sticky notes on the pages that excited her most. Course descriptions, student-led clubs, dorm room layouts. I sat beside her at the table and let her explain each one. Her eyes lit up as she talked about campus life. Late-night studying, internships, student-run clinics. Her voice carried that fluttering energy only a 17-year-old can summon after surviving disappointment. She was coming back to life. And so was I. Sunday evening, I found myself in the attic. I hadn't been up there since Robert died. It still smelled like cedar and insulation. I opened a few old boxes, not to chase memories, but to sort what would stay and what would go. It was a strange thing, that urge to clean before a trial, but I think I needed to feel control over something. In one box, I found an old checkbook ledger, the last one Robert had used before he fell ill. Tucked between the pages was a note in his handwriting. It wasn't addressed to me, just a quote. "Your name is your shelter. Keep it dry. Keep it true." I sat on the attic floor for a long time with that note in my lap. Maybe Robert knew something about what was coming, or maybe he had learned it the hard way himself. Either way, I took that paper and brought it downstairs, framed it. put it by the front door. By Tuesday, the weather had turned. Rain rolled through in thick grey sheets. I sat at the kitchen table while Timothy and Lane walked me through courtroom logistics one final time. Where I'd sit, when I'd speak, what to do if I felt overwhelmed. They had even arranged for a trauma-informed court advocate to be available, just in case. I didn't think I'd need it, but knowing it was there made all the difference. The day before the trial, Brandon's lawyer sent one last document, a revised settlement offer. He would return 70% of the funds if we agreed to seal the court records and sign a non-disclosure agreement. He wanted silence, again. This time, Timothy didn't answer for me. He let me decide. I didn't hesitate. I said no. Not because I needed revenge, but because my story was not a secret. It was not shameful. It deserved to be told in the light. I spent that evening walking through the house, turning off lights one by one, letting myself feel the full weight of what was ahead. It wasn't fear that filled me. It was readiness. Brandon had stolen more than money. He had tried to take my name. But what he didn't understand was that names are not made of ink and paper. They are built on choices, on silence broken, on daughters defended. And mine had never been clearer. The courtroom was quiet when I walked in. Not silent like a church, but heavy with the kind of stillness that settles when something serious is about to begin. The walls were pale beige, the chairs scratched slightly against the tile. I remember the way my heels echoed across the floor, how the sound didn't match how small I felt inside. Mary Beth wasn't with me. That was a choice we made together. She wanted to come, but I told her this was mine to carry. I didn't want her last memory of high school to be watching her brother try to deny her future. Lane and Timothy sat on either side of me. Their presence was quiet, solid, not like guards, more like anchors. I kept my hands folded in my lap, nails bare, no jewelry, nothing to distract, just me, the mother, the trustee, the woman whose signature had been forged, the woman who was finally speaking. The judge called the case into session. Brandon sat across from me, 2 rows over, one chair closer to the bench. He looked thinner than I remembered. Not weak, but restless. His suit was sharper this time, dark blue, tailored, his expression unreadable. Beside him, his new attorney sat tall and stiff, flipping through notes. The opening arguments began. Timothy stood with calm resolve and laid out the case. A clear trail of misappropriated funds, a falsified signature, a trust account drained and used to purchase property, vehicles, and private expenditures. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't exaggerate. He simply presented the facts, point by point. Then Brandon's lawyer stood. He spun a different story. He called the situation a tragic family misunderstanding. He claimed I had grown forgetful and resentful after my husband's death. He said Brandon had tried to help, only to be punished for acting in good faith. He painted me as a grieving widow, clinging to control, a woman unable to accept change. He ended his statement by calling Brandon a devoted son. I didn't move, not even to blink. The first witness was Lane. She spoke with precision, laying out the timeline, the emails, the digital records, the fake documents, the data trails. She was methodical and relentless. The judge took notes without looking up. Then it was my turn. I stood slowly, walked to the stand, and faced the room. I had not written a speech. I didn't need one. I spoke about Mary Beth, about how her father and I had started the account when she was 5, how we added to it every year, through birthdays and holidays and odd jobs. I spoke about the pride we felt building a future for her, about the silence that followed when Robert passed, about how I had trusted Brandon to help manage the paperwork because he was family, because he was my son. Then I spoke about the day the balance dropped, about the forged signature, the fake transactions, the day I found the house in someone else's name, and the day my daughter realized her college dreams had been spent on a stranger's champagne. My voice didn't shake, not because I was strong, but because I had already fallen apart and rebuilt myself. When I finished, the room was still. The judge thanked me. I stepped down. I didn't look at Brandon. The next witness was a forensic specialist. She confirmed the signature had been forged, that the withdrawal documents showed copy-paste patterns, that the timestamps on the files didn't align with the bank's internal protocols. She was exact, scientific, unemotional. Brandon's lawyer cross-examined, but it was surface level. The evidence was too tight, the story too clean. Then Brandon took the stand. He said he thought the money was his, that his father had always said they would take care of each other, that I had verbally promised the funds to him after the funeral, as a way to keep the family whole, that he never meant harm, that it was all a mistake. He said Mary Beth was young, that she'd have time to rebuild, that what was done was done. He said I was making this harder than it needed to be. He said he was sorry I felt betrayed. That last line sat in the air like sour smoke. Timothy's cross-examination was short. He asked one question about the timeline of the Clearwater Properties purchase and the trust account depletion. Brandon stammered, then paused, then blamed the escrow office. The judge called for recess. We stepped outside. I sat on the bench by the vending machine and drank warm water from a paper cup. Lane sat beside me. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. That afternoon, the judge delivered her preliminary findings. The court acknowledged sufficient evidence to proceed with the full civil claim. Brandon was found liable for breach of fiduciary duty, financial misconduct, and forgery. A formal restitution process would begin. The house would be placed under temporary receivership until a full financial audit could be completed. The court also issued a civil protective order preventing Brandon from contacting me or Mary Beth until further notice. The trial wasn't over, but the air had shifted. Something had broken loose. Not the bond between mother and son. That had broken long ago. What broke now was the illusion that he could still win this through performance. And what settled in its place was truth. Unflinching, documented, irreversible. Under the pale sky of early spring, the world outside felt deceptively quiet. Trees were beginning to bud, and cardinals chirped on the edge of the porch railing like nothing in our lives had ever unraveled. But inside me, the storm had only just begun to settle. The court had ruled in our favor for now. Brandon was restricted, restrained, exposed. And yet there was no comfort in that victory, not the kind I used to imagine. There was no relief, only a strange kind of stillness, like standing on the shore after the wave has pulled back and not knowing if another one will come. Timothy called that morning. The judge's ruling had been processed. The next hearing would finalize the restitution terms. The Clearwater house would be frozen under financial receivership. The court would assess how much of the stolen funds could be recovered. That process, he said gently, would be long, possibly years. I thanked him, then sat at the kitchen table with a blank sheet of paper. There were things I needed to do that the court couldn't handle. Mary Beth's future needed rebuilding, not just the account, but her faith. Her belief that the people she trusted wouldn't turn on her for convenience, that she could still step into the world without looking over her shoulder. She didn't say much about Brandon anymore. I think that silence was a kind of scar, a protective layer. Some wounds don't bleed out loud. I started drafting a new trust, a separate one. Lane helped. We built it from the ground up with new terms, new custodians, all fully transparent. I placed the new funds into a college reinvestment vehicle under her sole name. Every document bore only my initials and hers. Every clause was reviewed twice. It wasn't just money. It was a declaration. You matter, and no one will take that from you again. That same week, the attorney representing the receivership contacted Timothy. She explained that Brandon and Brenner had vacated the property without notice, left furniture, decor, even a few unopened packages in the driveway. No keys returned, no forwarding address. Lane said it was expected. Men like Brandon rarely face things head-on. They retreat, reinvent, start over somewhere else where no one knows the full story. But now, at least on paper, his story would follow him. The court ruling would be public. The restitution filing would remain on record. And Brenner's digital footprint was already tagged in every legal blog that had picked up the case. It wasn't revenge. It was consequence. I had begun to understand the difference. A few nights later, I walked past Mary Beth's room. She was on a video call with her future roommate. They were laughing about something on the screen. She had printed out a photo of their dorm building and taped it to the side of her bookshelf. I paused at the doorway, just long enough to memorize the sound of her laugh. Then I went back downstairs and opened the last drawer of Robert's desk. Inside was a worn legal pad with faded pencil marks. A list of things we'd hoped to do once we both retired. Visit the Grand Canyon. Take a train to Canada. Try cooking a French recipe without burning it. I ran my fingers over the paper, tracing his old, neat script. Most of those things had never happened. But I realized something as I read them now. Back then, we had made plans in the quiet belief that time was endless, that trust was forever, that family would hold. But life taught me otherwise. So I began my own list. It wasn't grand. It wasn't even long. It started with this. Take Mary Beth to orientation yourself. Walk with her across the campus. Let her see you proud. And this, keep the garden this spring. Replant the lavender. You always loved the scent. And this, say his name less in your head. Say hers more. The next morning I walked into the garden just before sunrise. The grass was wet. The air was cold. I stood at the edge of the raised beds, hands in my pockets. The hydrangeas had survived the frost. Stubborn things. They held on even when the cold lingered too long. I decided I would too. Because this chapter wasn't about loss anymore. It was about choosing what to carry forward. I had no desire to punish Brandon further. I no longer needed to understand what had broken in him to make him what he became. That was his burden now. Mine was lighter, and mine was mine. The official letter arrived on a Thursday. Thick paper, embossed seal. I opened it at the kitchen counter next to the bowl of apples I had just washed. It confirmed what Timothy had already told me on the phone. The court had approved the full restitution judgment. Brandon was to repay $193,000 in structured payments over the next 7 years, with annual interest applied. The Clearwater house would be sold under court supervision, with proceeds distributed accordingly. It was done. Not finished, but settled. There would be no appeal, no renegotiation, no last-minute offer hidden in a courier envelope. I held the letter in my hands, stared at it for a long time, then folded it neatly and slid it into the drawer next to the old takeout menus. And just like that, the fight was over. That night, I sat on the back porch and watched the sky turn from amber to slate. A small breeze stirred the chimes near the gutter, and for the first time in months, I noticed the way silence could be soft again. Not empty, not tense, just still. Mary Beth came outside later and sat beside me. She didn't ask what the letter said. She had seen enough papers on our table to understand that sometimes the weight of a document isn't in the words, but in the ending it carries. We didn't speak for a while. We just listened to the night. Eventually, she leaned her head on my shoulder. I rested my hand over hers and closed my eyes. In the morning, I cleaned out the last of the court boxes. Lane had offered to archive everything digitally, and I told her yes. I didn't want stacks of printed pain taking up space in our house anymore. I sorted through folders one final time before letting them go. Some held statements I had read in tears, others were cold, clinical, forensic reports, account charts, payment timelines. All of them had once felt like weapons. Now they felt like dust. I walked down the hallway and opened the door to the small spare room, the one Robert had always used as an office. It had become a storage space, but I cleared it that afternoon. A new bookshelf, a small desk, 2 chairs. I wanted that room to become something else. Not a shrine, not a hiding place, a space for growing forward. Later, I printed a photo, one of Mary Beth and me, taken at the campus tour last weekend. She had asked a stranger to take it, her arm around my shoulder, my smile not forced. It was the kind of image that didn't need explanation. It belonged in that room. The next few days passed without incident. No calls from Brandon, no letters from his lawyer. The silence didn't feel ominous anymore. It felt earned. Lane stopped by to drop off the final digital files. She gave me a small flash drive and said she had backed it up in the cloud as well. Then she hugged me longer than usual. I told her thank you. She smiled and said I didn't owe her thanks, but I gave it anyway. Some words are less about owing and more about honoring. The garden had started to bloom again. The lavender was strong this year. I clipped a few sprigs and placed them in a jar near the kitchen sink. The scent filled the room like a quiet reward. I kept thinking about Robert, about how he used to say life had a way of circling back to center. I hadn't believed him then, but now, standing in this new calm, I understood what he meant. Center wasn't peace without pain. It was knowing who you were in the middle of it. On Sunday evening, I wrote a letter to myself. It wasn't long, just a few sentences. You kept your word. You stayed present. You told the truth even when no one clapped for it. And you protected your daughter without becoming someone else to do it. I folded it, sealed it, and tucked it inside the desk drawer in the new room. I didn't know what came next. Not in the detailed way I had once planned everything. But I knew this. Whatever it was, I would face it from solid ground. Not broken, not bitter, whole. Summer came quietly that year. No grand announcements, no dramatic heatwave, just the slow shift of light and the way the evenings stretched a little longer with each passing week. Mary Beth graduated in a modest ceremony held on the football field behind her high school. Folding chairs, a cheap sound system, families in sun hats and sensible shoes. I sat 3 rows back with my hands folded and my heart steady. When they called her name, she walked tall, shoulders back, chin lifted, no hesitation. She didn't look at me until she reached the other end of the stage, but when she did, her smile was real, and that was enough. After the ceremony, we went out for pie, just the two of us. She didn't ask about Brandon. I didn't bring him up. The space between us was no longer about missing pieces. It was about what remained, what we had built again, together. Weeks passed. She packed for college, bought twin sheets and shower shoes, sorted through notebooks, picked out a small lamp she said reminded her of our kitchen. I helped her load the car, then I watched her drive off down the long curve of our neighborhood. No tears, just a slow breath. I stood there for a while, alone on the porch, hands on the railing, until the car disappeared from view. That evening, I walked into the spare room, the one that used to be Robert's office. I lit the candle near the desk, opened the drawer, and pulled out the letter I had written to myself. I read it again. You kept your word. You stayed present. You told the truth even when no one clapped for it. And you protected your daughter without becoming someone else to do it. I folded it and placed it back in the drawer. Then I sat down and began writing another. This one, for her. It wasn't filled with advice or caution, just presence, just this. Wherever you go, you are never lost to me. Not in distance, not in silence, not in time. I signed it simply, Mum. Later that night, I walked out to the garden. The lavender had bloomed again, thicker this time. I brushed my hands across the tops of the stalks and let the scent cling to my skin. The wind was light, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't brace against it. I let it move through me, not as a threat, but as proof that I had made it through, that I had chosen my daughter, that I had chosen myself, that the story did not end in betrayal. It ended in clarity, in protection, in peace, and in the quiet knowing that I had done what mothers do. I stayed, even when it hurt, even when it cost everything. I stayed. If you've ever had to stand your ground when no one believed you, if you've ever rebuilt your life after the ones closest to you tried to tear it down, then this story is yours too. Share your thoughts or your story in the comments. Your voice might be the light someone else needs to keep going. We read every word. Because here, silence doesn't mean weakness, it means waiting for the right moment to speak. And now, it's your turn.